So to chair the first session, which will be given by Professor Dr. Markus Gabriel, Chair of Epistemology, Philosophy of the Modern and Present Age at the Institute for Philosophy in North Rhine-Westphalia, and the Institute for Philosophy, International Center rather, at the University of Bonn. He has wide-ranging interests in areas of specialization: metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of mind, ancient philosophy, early modern, and what brought me to Bonn initially through the summer schools, his area of specialization in Kant and German idealism. And I think throughout this, Markus displays a deep sensitivity to skepticism, so I think a perfect person to begin the talk. The talk is entitled, "What Kind of Idealist, if any, is Hegel?"
There is a handout. In a certain sense, this talk is part of an ongoing conversation that I have with Sebastian Rödel, and I saw that he's going to speak about absolute idealism, so I decided to speak about absolute idealism too. Obviously, and on many levels, Hegel's philosophy is a response to skepticism. I will consider a part of Hegel's philosophy that is, in surprising ways, also a response to skepticism, namely Hegel's engagement with the concept of idealism. And, well, this is where I start. In contemporary philosophy, idealism still suffers from a fairly bad reputation. It's commonly associated with subjectivism, solipsism gone wild, or at best, with some kind of phenomenalism. Views of this form seem to be expressions of ill-conceived responses to perceived skeptical threats, so that typically the question arises how to avoid the various traps that might lead to idealism and its varieties, rather than trying to make sense of it as an independent option. In what follows, I will try to make sense of the basic features of Hegel's absolute idealism. What makes this task particularly difficult is, of course, that Hegel, since the second half of the 19th century, has been regarded as the epitome of idealism at its worst. In this context, idealism has been understood to involve the denial of the existence of a thoroughly mind and attitude-independent natural external world, and the assertion that everything there is fundamentally mental. Hegel does not hold either of this, as you will see. On this model, idealism would be both a crazy epistemological and an incredible metaphysical view, something which stands in need of diagnostic treatment or refutation at most. However, in my view, what is really going on in Hegel is precisely a repudiation of the premises leading to views of this form, which is quite clear from his critique of subjective idealism in Berkeley and Fichte, as well as from his critique of Kant's transcendental idealism, which he sees as at least implicitly committed to the coherence of subjective idealism. Hegel himself is busy diagnosing the shortcomings that might lead to idealism in the suspicious form, which he treats as resulting from an insufficient reaction to skeptical threats. This has not gone unnoticed. Various recent interpreters, such as Bill de Vries, Kenneth Westphal, or here in Germany, Christoph Halbig, have urged that Hegel actually is in the line of business of defending a form of direct realism on the basis of an account of perception designed precisely in order to avoid what is commonly called idealism. Remarkably, the by now classical realism-anti-realism debate has generally provided us with a better way of thinking about idealism. It's not necessary to associate idealism with an outrageously substantial metaphysical view, according to which reality as a whole is somehow mental or spiritual. I therefore agree with Crispin Wright when he associates idealism with anti-realism. As he puts it at the very outset of Truth and Objectivity, I quote, "For all the vilification and caricature which its critics have meted out over the years, the idealist tradition in philosophy has proved sufficiently durable to encourage the belief that, at least locally, there are insights for which it is striving, but for which its persistently controversial character suggests we have yet to find definitive means of expression," end of quote. In recent years, a lot of work has been done in this respect with Kant and Hegel. Contemporary interest in Hegel in America, throughout the English-speaking world, and in my neck of the woods, that is here, stems largely from two groups. One group is busy making sense of Hegel's concept of recognition and the associated practical philosophy. I will not talk about this. The other group is interested in Hegel's potential contribution to epistemology, metaphysics, the philosophy of mind, and other areas of theoretical philosophy. The question of idealism is central to both groups, even though I will only focus on the second group. Kant-inspired forms of constructivism or anti-realism about practical reasons are certainly more widespread among contemporary philosophers than their counterparts in theoretical philosophy. This is why I will exclusively focus on the epistemological issue of idealism. As Brandom, a well-known champion of a rational reconstruction and defense of a Hegel-inspired form of objective idealism, puts it, I quote, "The thought that that world is always already there anyway, regardless of the activities, if any, of knowing and acting subjects, has always stood as the most fundamental objection to any sort of idealism," end of quote. If one takes a closer look at the contemporary renewal of Hegelianism by Brandom and McDowell at Pittsburgh and Pippin and others at Chicago and by Michael Forster now at Bonn, one will soon notice that the term idealism is not always clearly enough elucidated. As Brandom, for instance, uses it as a term of appraisal when he speaks both of objective idealism and of idealism full stop as a set of ideas relating to the potential rejection of the existence of an external world. McDowell, on the contrary, in a widely discussed paper, interprets Hegel's idealism as a radicalization of Kant, by which he means an anticipation of his view that the deliverances of sensibility are already within the bounds of the conceptual, however exactly one then fleshes this out. As we will see in due course, it's actually quite difficult to figure out just exactly what kind of an idealist, if any, Hegel is. One might wonder, is it not just an established historical fact that Hegel belongs to a group of thinkers rightly subsumed under the label of German or post-Kantian idealism? Historical classification of this form, however, is not exactly very helpful as long as we are not told what the idealism part in German idealism might mean. Everybody, including Kant himself, agrees that Kant was a transcendental idealist, but it's notoriously hard to work out what this really means. Going through the literature, it sometimes seems that what most philosophers would agree about when it comes to this position is that whatever it consists in, one shouldn't hold it. A somewhat more sophisticated way of giving voice to the notion that there really was such a thing as German or post-Kantian idealism, such that Hegel would certainly be a good enough candidate for being a member of that party, goes something like this. Right after the publication of Kant's first critique, critics started worrying about the relation between things and themselves and appearances. In particular, most epistemologists of the time argued that the strict unknowability and uncognizability of things in themselves, to which Kant explicitly commits in many passages, makes the entire concept of things in themselves incoherent. At the very least, it seemed to many critics that things in themselves are an idle wheel in the context of any explanation in which one might want to invoke them. For instance, if we want to give an account of the potential metaphysical difference between how things appear to us as specifically human perceivers due to our overall epistemic and natural outlook, and how they actually are, regardless of appearances in that sense, the distinction should better not be drawn between causally active appearances and causally impotent things in themselves. If Kant indeed held that no category at all can justifiably be applied to things in themselves, then we could neither claim to know that there is more than one thing in itself, nor that they ever instantiate causal patterns and so forth. Actually, we could not even claim to know that a single thing in itself exists, given that existence, Dasein, for Kant is another category. And I have not even mentioned worries associated with the view that things in themselves are neither spatial nor temporal. Against this background, or perceived background, I'm not arguing that this is the right way of reading Kant, I'm just saying that this is a perceived background at the time, it seems perfectly reasonable to understand Fichte's, Schelling's, and also Hegel's official denials of the existence and theoretical usefulness of things in themselves as a brute committal to a Kantianism without things in themselves. So that's, I think, the worst reading of what they're doing. They would then be buying this Kantianism, the bad Kantianism, and do without the things in themselves. So that would be even worse. So you would have free-floating pseudo-Kantian appearances without things in themselves. That's, I think, the level of sophistication of Popper's reading of Hegel or Searle's. On this construal, the post-Kantian idealists gave up on the idea of things in themselves, but retained the appearances and took it from there. While readings of this kind have been prominent for decades and were held by philosophers as distinct as Russell and Heidegger, almost no neo-Hegelian of the most recent stripe accepts even the broad strokes of this reconstruction. For one thing, it's clear from many passages, in particular from passages in the Encyclopedia, that Hegel does not at all reject the mind-independent existence of the external world, a term, Außenwelt, he explicitly uses. He does not doubt that nature is a domain unified among other things by being what it is, regardless of how we think about it. That's exactly his definition of nature. There's no textual evidence that Hegel thought that nature was somehow mind-dependent. At the most, he can be read as claiming that nature is idea-dependent, where this means that nature is intelligible in that it exhibits structures we can make sense of by building adequate theories. The philosophy of nature is one part of Hegel's system, where this minimally just means that it's an independent topic of conceptual clarification, a topic one has to deal with independently of the concepts employed when it comes to understanding logics or spirit, the other two larger meta-sections of Hegel's enterprise. In what follows, I will focus on the theoretical issues associated with the concept of idealism, as a discussion of Hegel's view regarding the epistemology and ontology of practical norms would go way beyond the scope of a single paper. My paper consists of 3 parts. In the first part, I will take a closer look at Hegel's treatment of subjective idealism that's often ignored in the literature. In the second part, I will reconstruct the outlines of his critique of transcendental idealism, because he himself says he's neither a subjective idealist nor a transcendental idealist, so we need to figure out what this means for him. In the final part, I will argue that absolute idealism, Hegel's preferred version of idealism, really consists in a set of methodological assumptions designed to guarantee the overall intelligibility of what there is. In particular, Hegel understands absolute idealism as a commitment to what he calls the absolute idea. So absolute idealism is about the absolute idea. He claims that the absolute idea has 2 manifestations, nature and spirit, which for him means precisely that it's not exclusively geistig, let alone mental in a more narrow sense. Anticipating the conclusion, my view is that Hegel's absolute idealism is not a first-order metaphysical view in the sense of a view about the composition of ultimate reality or the furniture of mind-independent fundamental reality. Rather, it's a defense of the metaphysical idea that there are different kinds of facts, such as natural, mental, and social facts, which share a logical structure that guarantees their overall intelligibility. When I say that absolute idealism is a metaphysical view, I intend to convey the notion that it's precisely not, to borrow a formulation of Crispin Wright's again, I quote, a thesis about the bounds of reality, the thought that, as it were, the totality of facts is conveniently but mysteriously trimmed to ensure that there's nothing that outreaches human inquisitiveness, end of quote, which he ascribes to McDowell, that view, but that's of course polemical. Such a thesis would be an example of a first-order metaphysical absolute idealistic view. Contrary to that, absolute idealism amounts to a defense of the view, you will find this on the handout later under principle of intelligibility. Absolute idealism amounts to a defense of the view that it cannot be a priori that the evidence transcendence of some contingent facts of the matter speaks against the idea that a generally reliable epistemic match between our beliefs and the world has to be in principle detectable. Underestimation of such a distinction between a first-order metaphysical and a meta-metaphysical reading of the idea that reality is in principle intelligible might account for the potential confusion in McDowell's way of putting this in mind and world, and subsequently in his Hegel papers. For the metaphor of the unboundedness of the conceptual or the logical space of reasons that somehow covers everything might be read either as a claim about the structure of the world or as a claim to the effect that there is no barrier internal to the conditions of objective purport separating thought from what there is. In my interpretation of his absolute idealism, Hegel holds the latter, while he wants to distinguish it from the former, which he rejects. So part 1, subjective idealism. As is common today, Hegel treats Berkeley as a prime subjective idealist. In his lectures on the history of philosophy, he characterizes the position of subjective idealism in the following way. That's quote 1 on the handout. Subjective idealism says, there are no external things. They are a way in which our self is determined. In respect to sensation, this has to be admitted. I am passive in sensing. Sensation is subjective. It is being, a state, a determinacy in me, not freedom. My translation, because if you read the official translation, you will see why people will have thought that Hegel is a subjective idealist, because the official translation reads, blah, 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 subjective idealism declares that there are no external things, that they are but a determination of ourself. This must be admitted in respect to pure sense perception. So they translate Empfindung as sense perception, but of course Empfindung is sensation and Wahrnehmung would be perception. So Hegel is not making a point here about perception, but about sensation. And if you confuse the two in the very translation, then it seems as if Hegel was committing to subjective idealism here on some level, which he isn't. Hegel's basic idea is that subjective idealism consists in the view that our access to what there is irremediably mediated by the alleged fact that we can only know what there is by sensing it. He then points out that such a form of empiricism, which he calls Erfahrungsphilosophie, philosophy of experience, confuses the true claim that we cannot perceive anything without at the same time being in a state of sensing with a false claim that perceiving something to be the case is sensing it. Hegel's first argument against Berkeley has it that Berkeley has at least to admit that it's built into the appearances that they appear at least as if we did not produce the objects of experience by perceiving them. The objects at the very least appear to be given. As Hegel puts it, that's quote 2, immediately the necessity of the representation contradicts the being in itself of that which represents. Because the being in itself is the freedom of that which represents, which, however, does not produce the representations freely, but for it they have the form and determinacy of something other with respect to it, end of quote. For Hegel, Berkeley recognizes the problem that the content, or rather the objects of experience, do not appear to be produced in the way in which he then claims, which is why he introduces the ad hoc solution that the contents or objects of experience seem to be given and not produced by mental acts due to the fact that God is the hidden causal factor in experience. However, Hegel points out that this is a bad solution for many reasons. What is particularly bad about the solution is that it needs to invoke an external factor causing us to have an experience to the effect that P after all. Thus, there has to be a sense in which there is an external world, even though the external world on Berkeley's model from the theorist's perspective consists of other minds, most notably of his and God's mind, and their purely experiential contents. Thus, subjective idealism does not solve the problem of the external world it faces by either giving up on the existence of an external world or even by bracketing it. It just replaces a more commonsensical notion of the external world as containing specimens of middle-sized dry goods, to quote Austin, with a notion of the external world as only containing God's ideas. I quote Hegel, quote 3, the inconsistency in the system God has again to make good, the Gadder, die Gosse. That's what Hegel writes. This is, by the way, also not translated in the English translation, Gott die Gosse. We leave it to God, end of quote. Hegel's diagnosis of why subjective idealism appears attractive in the first place is that it promises a wholehearted solution of external world skepticism by simply denying the existence of matter. It unifies reality by giving up on the ontological commitment to one kind of substance, usually recognized, material substance. In this context, it's important to point out that Hegel himself believes that the question how mind and nature fit together in an integrated conception of what there is must give an account of two potentially opposite conceptual poles. On the one hand, we want to be able to understand that reality is largely the way it is regardless of our epistemic capacities and activities. This is a very modest form of realism. Hegel nowhere denies. He refers to it under the heading of the theoretical idea or the idea of cognition in his Science of Logic. On the other hand, there is a more presumptuous direction of thought, as Crispin Wright again puts it, namely, I quote Wright, that while such fit as there may be between our thought and the world is determined independently of human cognitive activity, we are nevertheless in favorable circumstances capable of conceiving the world aright and often of knowing the truth about it. That's what Crispin calls the presumptuous direction of thought. The modest direction of thought is just the idea of largely mind-independent external reality. Let us speak of the principle of intelligibility here. That's on the handout. This principle claims that a coherent conception of the world has to be compatible with the fact that we often get it right, which is not to say that there's nothing we somehow cannot know. Yet, the principle denies that there's anything inherent in the concept of the world which would make it reasonable to believe on a priori grounds that there are objects and facts beyond human ken. Thus, Hegel need not, in addition to this principle, also commit to the very ambitious notion that we can know a priori that there's nothing that we cannot know. All he needs to argue for is that what we cannot know does not lie on the other side of a boundary between cognition and the absolute that completely separates them. Eine schlecht entscheidende Grenze. In my interpretation, a schlecht entscheidende Grenze is the idea that on a priori grounds we can know that there's a set of facts beyond human ken. This is how I interpret this quote. Nevertheless, Hegel is metaphysically more ambitious than even the presumptuous direction of the realism debate as presented by Crispin Wright. For he neither believes that the fit between our thought and the world is, as Crispin Wright puts it, determined independently of human cognitive activity, nor does he believe that our knowledge of the world in general has to rely on favorable circumstances, that is, on any kind of epistemic luck. Rather, he raises the question under what conditions we would be able to articulate the presumptuous direction of realist thought. What is it for us to know that knowledge involves a relation of fit between the world and human epistemic activity, if not to know even much more than Crispin Wright mentions? For how could we claim to know that we are ever in a position to know anything about the external world unless we could somehow guarantee that what there is intrinsically intelligible, that it is shaped in such a way that our most general concepts, such as our concepts of facts, objects, structures, order, etc., do not utterly go astray. If there's no reason to believe that our most general concepts ever hold good of the world because they carve at its joints, we might wonder how far the potential divergence between our overall theories of reality and reality itself goes. Hegel's criticism of Berkeley amounts to the position that Berkeley is precisely not able to make sense of the principle of intelligibility. For Berkeley accepts that our epistemic activity consists in creating a system of beliefs based on raw input given to us by God. In Hegel's reading, there's nothing intrinsically intelligible about the input itself as conceived by Berkeley, which is why he has to resort to God, the Godder. Yet this only covers up a conceptual problem and does not even come close to anything that one would want to call a solution. For Hegel, this is nicely brought out by the fact that Humean skepticism can easily be read as the outcome of Berkeleyan subjective idealism. Indeed, early modern idealism for Hegel is generally a response to a skeptical threat, namely external world skepticism, that misconstrues its own strategy as a set of substantial metaphysical discoveries, be it in the form of Berkeley's subjective idealism or Leibnizian monadology. For Hegel, they are roughly the same because he believes that they are in the same, that they have the same logical shape, a bad one. He expresses his contempt for Berkeley and Hume in the very title of the section of the period of the history of philosophy in which they have been working, a period he calls period of transition, die Übergangsperiode. The subtitle, which happens not to be translated in the English tradition, in the English edition of the lecture, says it all. That's Hegel. The subtitle is really not translated. The degeneration of thinking until Kantian philosophy. Das Verkommen des Denkens bis zur kantischen Philosophie. That's not translated, but this is how he thinks about Locke and Hume. It's unfair, but I'm just mentioning it. Quote 4. But since in the modern world this absolute substantiality, this unity of what is in itself and self-consciousness is fundamental, this faith in reality in general, skepticism has here the form of idealism. i.e. of expressing self-consciousness or certainty of itself as all reality and truth. The crudest form of this is that self-consciousness as individual or formal does not proceed further than to say all objects are our representations. We find this subjective idealism in Berkeley and another version of it in Hume, end of quote. Hegel typically refers to what he calls subjective idealism both as bad idealism and as formal idealism. Arguably, those are synonyms. He uses all three. He links this with his standard attack on traditional forms of empiricism, where these endorse the idea that the contribution of conceptual structures to our knowledge of the world is intelligible precisely because it is our subjective contribution. This makes the content potentially unintelligible, as we cannot guarantee against all sorts of skeptics that the concepts we employ in theory-building processes ever are able to get a hold of what is there, regardless of our theory-building processes. Bad idealism is bad in that it merely ties objectivity, das Gegenständliche, to consciousness, I continue a quote, merely saying of it that it is my feeling, mine. Despite apparent metaphysical modesty, this position holds ontologically that, again Hegel, a sensuously non-conceptual manifold of sensing is established in which there is no reason and with which this idealism has no further concern, end of quote. This is the upshot of what Hegel calls the false idealism of modern times, even though he already identifies the roots of it in ancient epistemology, most prominently in ancient atomism. Somehow Hegel believes that Democritus holds such a view. I leave that open. It's just one of the attributions that he makes. Bad idealism draws on the assumption that our representations of the world have a specific form due to our information filters, an idea heavily exploited by ancient skeptics from the Sophists to later academic and Pyrrhonian skeptics. On this level of analysis, it doesn't really matter whether we think of those information filters as an overall conceptual scheme or as a set of epistemic intermediaries that might be reified by using the metaphor of a veil of perception or of simple ideas, etc. The crucial idea of bad idealism is the view that we can only have access to a given reality by employing subjective categories, concepts lying in our minds. Yet if this were the case, how could we even claim to know that there is a given element in experience regardless of our further conception of the source from which the given element is supposed to be derived? How would we be able to draw a systematic distinction between the given element in experience and the contribution of our information filters? Subjective idealism owes us an account that individuates the given content regardless of the additional conceptual structuring. It only makes sense to draw the relevant distinction if we're able to predicate something of the given element. Yet this presupposes that at least on this level of epistemological analysis, we are after all capable of uncovering fully mind-independent reality. Otherwise, it remains completely mysterious how we could ever be in a position to draw a distinction between the form and content of experience. Crucially, Hegel critically identifies the premises motivating revisionary metaphysical maneuvers that might come to look like evidential support for subjective idealism. In his critique of the terms of Kant's refutation of idealism, he writes, that's quote 5, idealism in the sense of the view that there's nothing outside of my individual self-consciousness as individual, as also the refutation of this, the assertion that there are things outside of my self-consciousness as individual are the one as bad as the other. By the way, arguably this is where the famous being and time quote, where Heidegger makes exactly this point, is going back to. The truth or untruth does not rest in their being things or representations, but in their limitation and contingency, whether conceived of as representations or things, end of quote. Second part, transcendental idealism. This leads me to my second topic, the outlines of Hegel's worries about transcendental idealism. At this point, Kant enters the picture. The majority of contemporary reconstructions of Hegel's critique of Kant on this level rightly focus on two elements. One, Hegel's critique of form-content dualism. Two, his repudiation of the distinction between appearances and things in themselves. However, it's very important to add the third dimension of his engagement with Kant, as this leads to his concept of absolute idealism, namely 3, the problem of the world. I will say what this amounts to later, and I think this is really where the action takes place. And also where Hegel is probably engaging with real Kant. I will deal with this third aspect, the problem of the world, in the final section of my paper. In this section, I will give an outline of Hegel's worries regarding 1 and 2. Hegel officially engages with Kant's epistemology and metaphysics in 3 major works. In an early essay called Faith and Knowledge, that's McDowell's source in his paper, in his Science of Logic, and in his lectures on the history of philosophy. McDowell almost exclusively deals with the early material from Faith and Knowledge. Given the somewhat clearer exposition of the central themes in Hegel's mature lectures, I will concentrate on these. Generally, Hegel reads Kant's enterprise in the first critique as following an epistemology-first method in a problematic sense. In his view, the motivation behind the very idea of a critique of pure reason consists in the familiar motive that the skeptic forces us to present arguments to the effect that truth-apt thoughts, what Kant calls judgments, are not fundamentally sealed off from the world. It's already at this early starting point that of the enterprise that Hegel formulates a famous objection against the approach that he attributes to Kant, an objection opening the introduction to his phenomenology of spirit. The view under attack there is what we can call the unqualified instrument view of cognition. That's on the handout. And I say the unqualified instrument view of cognition because probably, certainly Kant does not hold that view, but he might hold a qualified instrument view of cognition that Hegel does not consider, though. According to the unqualified instrument view, cognition is characterized as an instrument used in order to grasp how things really are, what Hegel there simply names the truth. Die Erkenntnis dessen, was in Wahrheit ist. His question is whether we have any good reasons to question our capacity of acquiring cognition of what truly is. Let me just mention in passing that when he speaks of the truth, he refers to what we would call facts, and when he uses his high-flown word, the absolute, he refers to the totality of facts, the world as a specific kind of unified whole. For Hegel, it's misguided to think of our various epistemic capacities to know the truth, that is, to grasp the facts, in terms of a set of epistemic intermediaries that sometimes happen to get it right and sometimes happen to get it wrong. In contemporary terms, what Hegel ascribes to Kant and what he rejects would be a highest common factor model of cognition, according to which our epistemic standing with respect to the world would essentially seem to be the same to us, or rather be the same, even if we never had actually grasped a true thought or endorsed a true assertion. Against the background of a set of worries that might lead one to accept such a skeptical challenge, it only seems natural, Hegel even says commonsensical, to first guarantee that the epistemic intermediaries at the very least are truth-apt by exhibiting the relevant form of objective purport. In this case, I quote 6, cognition is represented as an instrument, as a way by which we want to take possession of the truth. Thus, before one can make one's way to the truth itself, one would have to cognize first the nature, the kind of one's instrument, end of quote. His favorite objection to this version of epistemology as first philosophy can be found throughout his entire career in various passages, most notably, as I've already emphasized, in his phenomenology of spirit. This is probably part of what McDowell had in mind when he described mind and world as, I quote, a prolegomena to the reading of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Hegel's basic objection against the instrument view has it that a successful articulation of the very view achieved would already amount to epistemological knowledge and thereby contradict the intended outcome that we might be completely sealed off from the world. The instrument epistemologist for Hegel would have to claim to know that there is a set of epistemic intermediaries such that they first explain why we might want to think of them as the highest factor common to the good and the bad case, and second, that they are truth-apt for some theoretically articulated set of reasons R1 to Rn. This is exactly what Kant is doing in his first critique in Hegel's reading. Yet the problem is that this immediately calls the familiar second-order skeptic onto the scene, who will respond that there are either epistemic intermediaries at play in the articulation of the theory itself, or, if there aren't, the instrument theorist does not believe that all cognition has the form his theory claims it has. Knowing that the theory is true would be entirely different from knowing something about the world. Hegel's preferred way out is to simply accept that cognition is already at work in any attempt to figure out what it is. Or, as he puts it, quote 7, to investigate the faculty of cognition means to cognize it. The requirement is thus, one is supposed to cognize the faculty of cognition before cognizing anything. It is like wanting to swim before one enters the water. The investigation of the faculty of cognition itself is cognizing. It can never arrive at where it wants to arrive, as it is already there, end of quote. Trying to refute a skeptic who is at the same time and for the same reasons worried about the proper execution of our sensory faculties and our intellectual faculties is futile, as such a skeptic would not even be able to formulate a justified worry in the first place. The justified formulation of skeptical worries about the proper execution of some epistemic procedure is justified to the extent to which it does not immediately undermine the justificatory procedures employed in the formulation. Against this background, the majority of Hegel's objections to Kant's transcendental idealism boils down to the overarching idea that Kant really holds to incompatible views about cognition and knowledge, one first-order view about truth and thought about the natural world, and a different, insufficiently articulated higher-order view about our knowledge of the conditions of first-order truth aptness. In this light, he approaches Kant's form-content dualism. Unlike some recent commentators who try to make sense of Kant's distinction between the conceptual and the non-conceptual contribution to a given empirical thought episode, Hegel splits Kant's famous principle that thoughts without intuitions are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind, into two potentially separate claims. The claim that there are empty thoughts without intuitions on the one hand, and the claim that there are blind intuitions without concepts on the other hand. Yet if this were the case, we could have a conception of, as Hegel puts it, thoughts without content, Gedanken ohne Inhalt. As a matter of fact, Kant indeed needs to be able to isolate thoughts from intuitions, at least in the context of his critique of the ideas of God, the world as a whole, and an immortal soul as potential objects of serious epistemic or theoretical inquiry. Beliefs to the effect that if there are 7 souls, then there are more than 5, or if God doesn't have a body, then he can move from one place to the other in no time, or what have you, according to Kant really are thoughts without content. This is how I would read, at least, what he says in the Transcendental Dialectics, his particular error theory. It's not the case that they merely happen to have transcendent truth conditions, positive or negative assessment of which is barred from us due to the limits of our knowledge or whatever. Claims about transcendent matters for Kant indeed are not even guesswork. That is, as long as they are presented as theoretical claims concerning the structure and content of what there really is. In his Transcendental Dialectics, Kant develops an error theory for discourse about God, the soul, and the world as a whole, which presupposes the intelligibility of empty thought severed from receptivity, which is the object of the investigation he calls a logic of illusion. Hegel now raises the following famous question. If there's empty thought and non-empty thought, what distinguishes the two of them? One answer to be expected from Kant is, of course, that non-empty thought is either straightforwardly empirical, synthetic a posteriori, or about the properties of the conditions of possibility of the former, synthetic a priori. In any event, all content of thought derives from possible experience and our relation to it, which is why Kant in one passage can refer to the world as field of possible experience, Feld möglicher Erfahrung. It's one of his definitions of the world or elucidations. On this model, the activity of thinking will consist in exercises of our epistemic capacities to put various elements belonging to the field of experience together in such a way as to accumulate glimpses of the world while having a larger world in view, to borrow from McDowell's treasure of metaphors again. Yet if all content is derived from the field of possible experience, it is all too tempting to see the activity of thinking putting non-empty thoughts together as Hegel puts it, something subjective. In this context, he's one of the first to charge Kant with an untenable form of psychologism on 2 levels. On one level, he polemically points out that Kant seems to merely dig out epistemic capacities from a soul sack, Seelensack, later echoed by Nietzsche, by the way. In a passage, as I said, later echoed by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, Hegel writes, quote 8, he, Kant, hunts through the soul sack to see what faculties are to be found there. And by merest chance, one happens to find reason there too. End of quote. So this really reads like Nietzsche, but it is Hegel. I verified it, so no one smuggled it into the text. The charge here seems to be that Kant introduces the idea of a given plurality of epistemic capacities we just happen to find in our overall epistemic equipment without ever being able to unify them under our concept of reason by seeing them as integral to reason as such. Kant wants to avoid this option as this would threaten to undermine the contrast between our specific set of capacities and those of potentially different forms of thinking, such as divine thinking. I quote Hegel, quote 9, sorry to all the Kantians, this is just Hegel, I'm not defending this. Not to mention the barbarous terminology, Hegel here refers to synthetic, analytic, a priori, a posteriori, Kant remains restricted and confined by the psychological point of view and empirical manner, end of quote. On another level, Hegel anticipates some of G.E. Moore's and Wittgenstein's later worries about the unity of the proposition. In a similar vein, Hegel believes that the unity of an endorsed proposition, a judgment, cannot entirely consist in the fact that there is a subjective synthesis. For we need to make sense of the idea that things hang together in just the way in which we take them to hang together when we assert that they are thus and so. Otherwise, it would easily look to us as if, to pick one of Hegel's own examples, a salt cube would really be nothing but a bundle of simple ideas, such as seems sweet at T1, looks like this from here at T2, and like that from here at T3, etc. If the assertion that there is a salt cube would have to be reconstructed as a subjective synthesis of atomic impressions, we would run into familiar conundrums about the question how there could objectively, rather than psychologically, be a thing with actual properties. Against this background, I read the entire phenomenology of spirit as an argument against the view that mind imposes order on a world that might be metaphysically shaped by structures entirely different from the best categories employed in our mentally constructed understanding of the world. Hegel generally calls the view that mind and world might be distinguished in such a way philosophy of consciousness, Bewusstseinsphilosophie. He thinks that philosophy of consciousness underpins the kinds of idealism, subjective and transcendental, he wants to reject, and he associates both with the notion that there might be a boundary that completely separates them. Let me be very brief regarding Hegel's critique of the thing in itself appearance distinction. Roughly speaking, the assumption that there is an unknowable and uncognizable thing in itself, in Hegel's eyes, is just an expression of a certain theory failure. This failure consists in believing that the content of experience is derived from a source potentially structurally different from the structures we are acquainted with by giving an account of our own rationality. For Hegel, this is a misguided picture of both the objectivity and fallibility of our knowledge of what there is. His point is that the usual trial and error process involved in figuring out how things are certainly does not presuppose the possibility of a maximal structural divergence between our conceptual scheme and what we are trying to make sense of by building theories. Giving up on the very idea of a thing in itself as an idle wheel in our epistemology with an inclination towards skeptical premises then does precisely not mean to start reducing everything to something mental. It means giving up on the idea that the mental is entirely subjective, a phenomenological layer of epistemic intermediaries. It would lead too far to go into more details of Hegel's critique of Kant, or again, of what he thinks Kant says, as he also believes that Kant's practical philosophy is largely driven by problematic epistemological and metaphysical assumptions. What is important for the focus of my interest in this paper is only that absolute idealism, the only idealism Hegel officially endorses, should not be interpreted as either having the shape of subjective idealism gone wild or inflated into a metaphysics, nor as having the shape of a refined version of transcendental idealism, as some contemporary interpreters have claimed. This is why I gave you all these quotes. So Hegel is not exactly sympathetic to the word transcendental idealism and anything associated with this. This leads me to my final topic, absolute idealism. The third point of Hegel's engagement with Kant is a good way of approaching absolute idealism as I understand it. As I said, Hegel's engagement with Kant's theoretical philosophy covers three central features of transcendental idealism. One, form-content dualism. Two, the distinction between things and themselves. And what I will focus on now, the problem of the world. I have so far sketched some of Hegel's worries and objections regarding transcendental idealism with respect to 1 and 2. However, it sometimes goes unnoticed that the problem of the world is quite central for Kant. Well, all of this is nicely spelled out in Guido Kreis's Bonn habilitation, Negative Dialectics of the Infinite, where he spells out the details of Kant and Hegel on the world, and let's see to which extent we agree here. In a letter to Christian Garve from September 21, 1798, Kant interestingly writes, that's quote 10, "It was not the investigation of the existence of God, immortality, and so on, but rather the antinomy of pure reason. The world has a beginning, it has no beginning, and so on, right up to the fourth. There's freedom in man versus there's no freedom, only the necessity of nature. That is what first aroused me from my dogmatic slumber and drove me to the critique of reason itself in order to resolve the scandal of ostensible contradiction of reason with itself." So here's another thing that awoke him from dogmatic slumber. This is not Hume, this is the problem of the world. Let us generally call the problem of the world the set of problems associated with the question how absolutely everything hangs together. Kant here more specifically mentions two worries: the question whether the world is finite or infinite in its spatial and temporal extension, and the question whether the structure of the world is deterministic in such a way that there can be no freedom in man, as he puts it. Famously, in the first critique, Kant informs us that engagement with Hume has awakened him from dogmatic slumber, which typically has been interpreted as relating to Kant's account of causation. Yet in the letter to Garve, Kant emphasizes that the main thrust of his arguments in favor of transcendental idealism is metaphysical, where metaphysics is the investigation of unrestricted totality, or, as I also like to phrase it, the theory of the world as world. Kant's own solution of the apparent contradiction of reason within itself is a form of metaphysical agnosticism. Precisely because the world is not a thing in itself, but a regulative idea driving the unification of our knowledge in the form of the ideal of systematic unity, there's no point in asking how absolutely everything hangs together. The systematic unity is restricted to appearances which might be a proper subset of a larger domain of entities, even though we have no theoretically justified ground to believe that this is indeed the case. We just have no warranted beliefs regarding absolutely everything, as indefinitely huge regions of what there is, the things in themselves, are simply no possible objects of empirically grounded inquiry. Claims to the effect that the world is such and so will therefore always remain undecidable. For Hegel, this is the quintessential claim of transcendental idealism. In order to understand his objections against claims of this form, it's important to look at a recently much discussed passage from the Science of Logic. In the passage I have in mind, he writes, quote 11, Paul Geyer and Rolf-Peter Horstmann are writing an idealism entry for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and they seem to focus on that Hegel quote. Here's the quote, Hegel on idealism. The claim that the finite is an idealization defines idealism. The idealism of philosophy consists in nothing else than in the recognition that the finite is not truly an existent. Every philosophy is essentially idealism, or at least has idealism for its principle, and the question then is only how far this principle is carried out, end of quote. So that's surprising. Every philosophy is idealism. He gives two even more surprising examples of idealism in that sense. Thales' dictum that everything is water and Greek atomism. Those are his first examples for idealism. As I understand him, he praises these rough positions for a simple reason. They try to make sense of essentially absolutely everything there is by coming up with a unified account of overall reality. Of course, Hegel neither believes that everything is water, nor that the world entirely consists of atoms and the void. What he points out in this passage is merely that idealism is a thorough commitment to the principle of intelligibility. His name for this idea at the very end of the Science of Logic is the absolute idea, and the view according to which the more specific methodological assumptions articulated in the Science of Logic chapter in the absolute idea amounts to a sufficient account of the principle of intelligibility, just is his absolute idealism. So absolute, if you want to know what Hegel's absolute idealism is, you have to understand what the absolute idea is. And the absolute idea is somehow related to the view that there's nothing intrinsic to the concept of how absolutely everything hangs together that puts it on the other side of whatever kind of a priori boundary. This does not rule out contingent evidence transcendence facts. So Hegel's not saying that there are no contingent evidence transcendent facts, such as facts holding, say, in another multiverse causally isolated from us, or what have you, or the number of trees in the Amazon right now. The first important aspect of this I would like to highlight is that Hegel's absolute idealism is not a view about the composition of the world or the structure of the fundamental nature of reality. On the level of metaphysics, Hegel does not tell us anything about what there is, where this would consist in providing us with substantial information about the denizens of the universe, nature, or reality. Let us call any view informing us about the structure of the world in this sense first-order metaphysics. Accordingly, my claim is that Hegel's absolute idealism is not intended as a direct contribution to the discipline of first-order metaphysics. We can contrast first-order metaphysics with meta-metaphysics and view Hegel as engaged in the activity of first and foremost giving an account of the overall intelligibility of what there is on the level of meta-metaphysics. This account is largely neutral when it comes to more specific ontological commitments. However, without further ado, it does spell out conditions that have to be met by any more specific first-order metaphysical account. There's at least one potential negative methodological verdict entailed by absolute idealism, namely the verdict that nothing can count as a successful first-order metaphysical account that does not meet the requirements of the principle of intelligibility. In this light, Tom Nagel rightly associates his recent reliance on the principle of what he calls the intelligibility of the world with absolute idealism. In order to begin understanding what Hegel means by the absolute idea, a concept he deals with in the concluding chapter of the Science of Logic, it might be useful to keep in mind that he's still dealing with the problem of the world as formulated by Kant. As a matter of fact, he describes the absolute idea as a combination of two subordinate ideas: the idea of theoretical cognition, the Idee des Erkennens, on the one hand, and the practical idea, the idea of the good, die Idee des Guten, on the other hand. He regards this as a unification of two strands in Kant's thinking, one grounding his theoretical philosophy and the other grounding his practical philosophy. More specifically, Hegel explicitly describes how things look from the perspective of the absolute idea. That's quote 12. That quote is somewhat written in Hegelese, so I will give you a translation of this in a second. Quote, accordingly, in this result, cognition is restored and united with the practical idea. The previously discovered reality is at the same time determined as the realized absolute purpose, no longer an object of investigation, a merely objective world without the subjectivity of the concept, but as an objective world whose inner ground and actual subsistence is rather the concept. This is the absolute idea, end of quote. I take it that the intended meaning of this is something like the following. The theoretical idea for Hegel is just the assumption that there is an objective world whose fundamental structures and makeup just are the way they are, regardless of how we take them to be, and if we cognize something, then we get in touch with that reality. On some level or other, we will have to be metaphysical realists. Hegel does not deny that there is a contrast of objectivity that distinguishes belief from knowledge, and that we can make sense of this contrast in terms of there being an objective world of facts, settling which of our theoretical beliefs are indeed true and which are not. On the other hand, there's the practical idea, the idea of the good, by which Hegel refers to the idea of a word-to-world direction of fit encapsulated in the concept of intentional action. If we are committed to there being facts of both kinds, facts to be studied from the theoretical stance and facts to be studied from the practical stance, we need a unified account of the categorical structure of reality that allows us to integrate both conceptions without running into the contradictions Kant describes in the Antinomies chapter of the First Critique. Achievement of such a stance is just what Hegel calls the absolute idea. Facts to be studied from the theoretical stance for Hegel are unified by belonging to nature, whereas facts to be studied from the practical stance in his division of labor belong to Geist, spirit. This is why he can claim that nature and spirit are in general different modes of exhibiting the absolute idea's existence. End of quote. All this means, in my admittedly deflationary understanding, is that we require a conception of facts that is sufficiently topic neutral in order to cover both nature and spirit in this sense. So why think that natural facts are more facts or more factive or whatever the right word would be than geistic facts? Why think that? And I think the absolute idea is just the claim that we have no reason to think of this in this way. So there's no metaphysical hierarchy such that natural facts are somehow better representatives of facts than other kinds of facts, say social facts. Otherwise put, our overall commitment to the principle of intelligibility should not be interpreted in such a way that we mistake it for a principle we can simply read off the universe or nature. Nature's intelligibility does not reveal itself in the fact that we know certain things about nature, as our local achievements in the uncovering of natural facts do not necessarily tell us anything about nature's intelligibility as a whole or in principle. What Hegel is looking for is precisely a topic-neutral, universal concept of facts or truth that allows us to develop what he calls a system of totality, where this would consist in an overall coherent conception of the broadest accessible way in which things hang together. It would be misguided to ground this conception in given natural facts. The intelligibility of nature is not itself a natural fact, as the principle of intelligibility also holds for spiritual, that is to say, mental and social facts. That a person runs a certain business and has certain beliefs can be as much a fact as that there are up quarks, if there are any, on both ends. Even if we have all sorts of reasons to ground some, if not all, mental facts in natural facts, this cannot tell us that nature's intelligibility is just more nature. The very idea of a unified domain we call nature is not derived from nature by our usual methods of investigating it. This also does not mean that nature should now be grounded top-down in mind, which would even be more of a confusion. Hegel's point is that the intelligibility of what there is as little derives from nature alone as it derives from the fact that there are mental facts. Against this background, McDowell's metaphor of the unboundedness of the conceptual is indeed quite adequate to capture the intention behind Hegel's absolute idealism. In his discussion of Wittgenstein, McDowell offers a formulation of the essence of absolute idealism. I leave it open to which extent this actually captures what Wittgenstein had in view, but the following passage from McDowell can nicely be brought to bear on the notion of idealism in Hegel. I quote McDowell: "There's no ontological gap between the sort of thing one can mean, or generally the sort of thing one can think, and the sort of thing that can be the case. When one thinks truly, what one thinks is what is the case." End of quote. Hegel's own name for this assumption is, I quote Hegel, "the pure correspondence of the concept and its reality." End of quote. Of course, figuring out in detail what Hegel believes to be required in order to make a convincing case for absolute idealism is a very different story. One would have to go through the details of the science of logic and his philosophy of nature, as these are an overall defense of absolute idealism, which Hegel presents as the result of the investigation into what he calls the laws of thinking, Gesetze des Denkens, which corresponds to his understanding of logic. The aim of my paper has been more modest. All I wanted to show is that Hegel has reasons to reject subjective and transcendental idealism, and that many of these reasons deserve fuller articulation. In addition, I wanted to argue that Hegel's absolute idealism should be interpreted as a contribution to meta-metaphysics rather than as a view about the fundamental nature of reality. Such an interpretation would also make sense of his constant engagement with the threat raised by ancient Pyrrhonian and modern skepticism that metaphysics might in principle be an ill-conceived form of discourse. The experience of massive disagreement on the battleground of metaphysics, Kampfplatz der Metaphysik, had already led Kant to the idea of needing a radically new framework for finally turning metaphysics into a science that is a methodologically controlled investigation. In this context, Hegel ascribes to Kant a provisional move from metaphysics to meta-metaphysics, a move he supports, but then sees him as entangled in a highly specific form of metaphysics, a combination of an entirely Newtonian conception of nature plus a transcendental idealist epistemology. Hegel rejects both tenets as he believes that neither is ultimately compatible with the principle of intelligibility. This aspect of his philosophy has hardly been explored yet, even though some contemporary metaphysicians have become aware of the potential relevance of Hegel's philosophy for meta-metaphysics. This is also reflected in a certain change of interest in recent debates from the phenomenology of spirit to the science of logic, and even to the encyclopedia, which is actually the only place where we find a sketch of Hegel's philosophy of mind in its relation to nature in our contemporary sense. My framework for a reconstruction of Hegel's arguments relies on the assumption sketched in this paper, namely, on the assumption that he's largely dealing with meta-metaphysical problems, a dimension almost entirely missed by classical Hegel critics from Marx and Heidegger via Russell to Popper. Thank you very much for your attention.